All right, greetings everyone. Looks like we are ready to get started. Thank you very much for joining us today, taking time out of your day to be part of this presentation. Hope you'll find it as interesting and informative as I certainly did. My name is Tara Hoke. I'm going to be your moderator. I am in-house counsel at the American Society of Civil Engineers, which is a publisher in the field of civil engineering. In my other role, I am a trustee board member and secretary of General Counsel, and I am going to be your moderator. Just a few minute introduction. Don't want to take too much time away from our presenters. We're going to spend about 45 minutes on our four presenters, and then try to allow more or less the remainder of that program, 30 to 40 minutes on a Q&A. So again, we encourage you and welcome questions. So this is our panel of speakers, and as we said in our registration material, what I want to acknowledge up front that we don't quite have, since this is a session on diversity, our panel is not quite as diverse, certainly, as we would have liked. Do think that's kind of a reflection of the continuing challenges that we have, both as an industry and certainly internally to cope. So it is a strategic priority for us, or a strategic objective of ours, to improve that and to do what we can to support increasing diversity within the academia and certainly the field of scholarly publishing. That said, we do have four wonderful, experienced, knowledgeable, and committed panelists, and so I would like to introduce them. Our first speaker is going to be Deborah Poff. She is the immediate past chair of COPE and a member of our trustee board, and she is currently leading COPE's efforts to develop an extensive, I won't say completely comprehensive, but discussion document on diversity and inclusion. And she's going to be talking about some of that and the issues that this document is intended to start the discussion on. Our next panelist is Rachel Safer. She is a council member and senior publisher at Oxford University Press, and she is currently leading one of our working groups on diversity name changes, but she's also going to discuss the progress of our discussion document on that topic, best practices around identity and name changes in publications. Our third panelist, Tess Tanenbaum, is an assistant professor at the University of California in the Department of Informatics. She too is a member of that working group that I just mentioned, and she for several years has been critical in advocating for and informing trans-inclusive name change policies. So she's going to share some of her experiences related to that, and she's also going to focus on so longer term goals around name changes in the field of scholarly publishing. And then our final speaker is Caroline Porter. She also is a COPE trustee, and she is executive publisher at Sage. And she is going to discuss historical offensive content in scholarly publishing and the issues that arise around that. I believe that's it for me. So actually the next thing I would do is hand it over to Deborah. Thank you, Deborah.
Okay, thanks very much. This is going to be, I've been doing research for some time for the discussion paper, which is, there's a large body of knowledge right now on all these issues. And so this is going to be a race through and necessarily an inadequate treatment of some fairly complex issues. But rest assured that my three colleagues who are going to speak after me will also add to this knowledge in a complementary way, and we will have a more thoughtful and timely discussion paper coming out before September. Okay, so today I'm going to briefly deal with four different elements of this general discussion: meanings of discrimination and bias, and identifiers for diversity and inclusivity, representational issues in the workforce, editors and editorial boards, and peer reviewers. Okay, I've got that in three. Peer review and diversity. Some groups are pushing the boundaries of what counts as expertise with respect to who gets to do peer review. And they're also issues of diversity around citation and algorithmics. There's a number of books and articles available now on factors in citation. Why are some authors researching what they call the algorithms of oppression? And then I'll briefly start introducing the recommendations for actions, but I'm going to run out of time and have to pass it along to my colleague Rachel before I can do a fulsome treatment of that. Okay, so we all think we know what discrimination and bias means, and those are synonyms, but really it's important to actually define what we're talking about here. So it's irrelevant, arbitrary, bias, and unfair variables or criteria utilized as basis for judgment about competencies. Behaviors or rules that have outcomes that impact others unfairly or are experienced as harm. Judgments that negatively impact persons based on systemic categories of membership. It can be a conscious issue, it can be an unconscious issue. And that's certainly true with respect to peer review and editing, that a lot of this stuff is actually unconscious and people are unaware that they're actually being discriminatory or biased. It can impact employment, promotion, fair representation, or how work is evaluated, including with peer review, acceptance of articles for publication, and who is studied and by whom. Subjects of discrimination or bias, which is identified in human rights and social justice research and policies. And this is not an exhaustive list. This is a fairly inclusive list, but part of the complexity is how many categories of bias and discrimination there are in social justice. So here's a few. Sex and gender, which of course can be unpacked in a number of ways. Race, ethnicity, visible minority, physical or mental challenges, poverty, illiteracy and innumeracy, geography, religion, language and culture, decolonized populations, including but not exclusively indigenous peoples, having stigmatizing diseases, being a member of a vulnerable population, including under certain circumstances, older persons and children. And I should note that none of these are mutually exclusive. And generally there's people who are discriminated against frequently belong to more than one of these categories. Okay, representational issues in the workforce. The two main recent surveys are US-based surveys, so they're not global entirely, but they are interesting. And one was done in 2018 by the Workplace Equity Project, and one was done in 2019 by Research by Diversity and Publishing Study. And the first one, the industry is 76% female, 81% white, and 83% heterosexual, yet men are nearly twice as likely to be in senior and executive management roles for which our study, the 2018 one, found no representation from respondents identifying as Black. In terms of the 2019 data, and this was broken down in terms of university presses. Okay, sorry about that. It's consistent data. According to the 2019 study, university presses are 81% white, 65% cis women, 79% heterosexual, and 88% non-disabled. So you can see that the data are telling. Here's 3 studies that have been done fairly recently that show that women are not represented as much in editorships as they proportionally should be, that journals invite too few women to referee in terms of an analysis of peer reviews for the American Geological Union, and another study on biomedical open access eLife journal that found that women worldwide and researchers outside of North America and Europe were less likely to be peer reviewers, editors, and last authors, where in those disciplines where last author is the most prestigious status role. And this is another interesting one, and this gets to unconscious bias. Tompkins, Zhang, and Heblin in 2017, reviewing refereed conference presentations, they compared single blind review, where people doing the reviewing knew the name of the person, versus double blind reviews where they don't. And they found that reviewers rate papers with famous authors or authors from prestigious institution more highly. There are some good news. There's some recent work that's showing an increase in proportional representation of women, both in terms of editorship And in terms of the number of peer reviewers, I can't get to that further, but it will definitely be included in the discussion paper. There was some interesting data that who's an editor is important. So they found that older women editors were more likely to select women peer reviewers than men or younger women. So again, this will be further discussed in the discussion paper. Issues with representation in terms of subjects of research and research authorship. Who is studied and who does the studying? And there's two examples, and you may be familiar with them. They're both fairly well known now. In 2017, the Journal of Political Philosophy published a 30+ page symposium on substantive normative issues in Black Lives Matter, and they were authored all by white philosophers. Scott Jaschik quotes from an open letter by Black scholar Professor Christopher LeBron, who had just recently published a book on the subject. Try to imagine my distaste when it was brought to my attention that your journal published a philosophical symposium on Black Lives Matter with not one philosopher of color represented. And this is the second example. Dynamics of conflict during the Ebola outbreak on the Democratic Republic of Congo from 2018 to 2019, published in BMC Medicine in 2020. The research was criticized because there were no Congolese researchers. The research was done by 17 non-Africans. Some of the Twitter feedback to that article is it is disheartening that parachute researchers are still conducted for Africa, and another said this is a colonized narrative. Linguistic discrimination, impact on citation. Most of the journals that are cited in the Web of Science, if not all, but I think that's changing a bit now, are in English. And many people publish in other languages, and some of them are listed here from this study. Most of the journals that are non-English are excluded from journal indexes, thus perpetuating the ideology that English is the global academic lingua franca. Now, there's a lot of problems with this, and it's partly a consequence of world rankings. World rankings of universities has cranked up and ratcheted up the criteria in many countries, most notably impacting China and India, in terms of the number of publications you need to graduate from a PhD, to be hired into a tenure track position, and required for tenure and promotion. And this includes a preoccupation with rank A journals, impact factors, and the number of citations, which really has a biasing effect toward authors and scholars for whom English is a second language, and it disadvantages them in peer review, which I certainly know as an editor. It's very hard to get people to review articles where there's language problems. They often write back to me and say, I don't have the time to work through this broken English. So a number of articles there are a number of articles about disadvantages of lower income countries and English as a second language, which would focus on the higher rejection rates and other related issues. So one impact is that 3/4 of the submissions and publications in predatory journals are participants from Africa and Asia. And I think it's a case of if you can't get accepted into an English language journal, then you desperately go somewhere where you can get accepted to keep your job or get a job. And this I noted as the fourth category. There's recent empirical work that has been published illustrating how discrimination operates in the lexical and structural construction of algorithmic data, that it is argued suppress or marginalize certain topics in research, so they're less likely to appear in citation venues, which in turn suppresses the citation of the authors of certain kinds of research. Okay, so I'll go through this very quickly. The grievance studies affair, I think most of you should know about the hoax papers. 20 fictional made-up academic papers by 3 authors were sent to a number of well-established feminist or left-leaning or specific purpose journals to show that they lacked rigor and that they were basically grievance studies. And 70 of these papers were accepted despite seemingly weird, overwrought identity politics as topics with a real lack of scholarly content or merit. And like the examples cited before, Black Lives Matter Symposium and the colonized parachute research, Questions are raised as to who gets to conduct research into some fields and some subjects of research. Further, the hoax papers raise the issue of how research into issues of marginalized people can be evaluated for excellence. What counts as good research in social justice research? So I think these are the most important questions in my presentation. And it is, who the peer reviewers are for articles related to social justice issue and discrimination matters. And I chose my own discipline as an example. Because philosophy, the last study that the American Philosophical Association did a couple of years ago showed that their membership is still 75% white and 75% male. Excellent scholarship requires expert knowledge with respect to the subject matter. So articles on feminist critiques of traditional ethical theory and philosophy should be reviewed by peers fully grounded in contributing to the literature on feminist ethical theories. A specialist in moral philosophy may know little to nothing about this field of feminist inquiry and consequently dismiss the topic as marginal. And this is the other important question. Can some researchers be excluded from certain areas of inquiry because it's not part of their lived experience? Now, there's two kinds of knowledge that we know. This is fairly common knowledge. One is knowledge by acquaintance, my lived experience. The other is knowledge by description, which is most academic research. The problem identified here is captured by the issue of helicopter or parachute research, where the subjects of the studies are absent from participation in the research in any meaningful way. The solution proposed is in broadening the representation of local researchers and the meaningful and engaged participation with the population studied. Also, the inclusion of researchers and authors from the study population are important to include, as they may represent both ways of knowing. Okay, so there's a lot of proposed solutions and advice. And here's what you can find on COPE's website as established advice. And I'm going to skip forward because I don't want to dip into my colleagues' time. Here's some actions that are being taken. Mentorship programs to mentor young scientists, women, minority reviewers as peer reviewers. Publishers are now giving advice as approved guidance for their publishing to include local researchers, particularly on research related to representation of marginalized or discriminated groups. There's organized sessions at many conferences now on editing, such as the Inane virtual conference on eliminating racism in editorial practices. People are tracking their demographic data and giving statements of encouraging submissions from all scholars regarding a position, affiliation, or country of origin. Okay, so here's again some advice on ESL, how to further help people for whom English is a second language. We currently, most big publishers have people to offer technical editing support if the article has been accepted, but we need to help people prior to that more proactively, including providing assistance in interpreting peer review critiques. And it's important to have statements that your journal is fundamentally committed to diversity and membership in a scholarship. And the American Association of University Presses, there's an article that I have in the references that I provide at the end of this that shows a number of the programs that are being funded currently, including programs from the Mellon Foundation, the Mellon University Press Diversity Fellowship Program with internships for underrepresented people in publishing to encourage them to become publishers. And I'm sorry that was such a race, but I look forward to the rest of the presentation and to the discussion afterwards. And I'd like to pass my baton over to Rachel.
So thanks, Deborah. And I want to provide everyone with a brief update on behalf of COPE's working group on post-publication author name changes. As you hopefully know, there is a group of COPE trustees and council members, as well as publishers, editors, and authors who are focused on post-publication author name changes, which I chair. This topic falls under COPE's core practice number 10, post-publication discussions and corrections, the description of which includes that journals, quote, must have mechanisms for revising articles after publication. In addition, this group aligns with one of COPE's current strategic priorities, which is responsiveness. COPE has pledged to, quote, deliver more timely responses to the evolving and challenging publication ethics issues faced by our members. So you may have read in the January issue of COPE Digest, COPE formed this working group in 2019. This was done in response to an increase in queries from COPE members seeking guidance, as well as to an increase in cases brought about COPE members, specifically by trans authors dissatisfied with their experiences trying to change their names. Until recently, journals and publishers didn't have formal or often even informal processes for author name changes. And anecdotally, when such requests were made, many journals and publishers said it was not possible to make changes. Even those that agreed would do so only after receiving quote unquote proof of identification and via a correction notice. The one and only name change case brought to the COPE forum happened in 2013, and rereading the discussion and advice now, frankly, makes me cringe. Worse, this case has since been cited by journals and publishers when rejecting name change requests. And at the group's recommendation, COPE added a note to this case stating explicitly that it should not be used as justification for denying the rights of trans authors who request that their names be changed on their earlier publication. The COPE Digest piece was about the working group itself, about the note added to the case I just mentioned, and a bit about the forthcoming guidance. In it, I explained that beyond streamlining the process, the group is trying to make the process more consistent for authors, journals, publishers, and relevant third parties, including major indexing and discovery services. To that end, working group members have connected with a variety of third parties like the STM Association, the National Information Standards Organization, or NISO, the Royal Society of Chemistry's Cross-Publisher Initiative, which is working to ensure a more inclusive and diverse culture within scholarly publishing, and even a California laboratory that is already submitting name change requests on behalf of their staff for patent applications and is willing to do so for journal articles too. Another piece in the January issue of COPE Digest was co-authored by the next speaker. Among other things, it details 5 guiding principles and best practices driving the working group, and hopefully driving all journals, publishers, and third parties still developing, refining, and/or implementing their own policies. And these 5 high-level principles are: number 1, accessibility, that name changes should be available to authors upon request without legal documentation, unnecessary barriers, burdens, or labor placed upon the author making that request. Number 2 is comprehensiveness. Name changes should remove all instances of an author's previous name from the records maintained and disseminated by the publisher. Number 3, invisibility. Name changes should not draw attention to the gender identity of the author, nor create a clear juxtaposition between the current name and the previous name. Number 4, expediency and simplicity. Name changes should be implemented in a timely manner and with a minimum of bureaucratic overhead. And number 5, recurrence and maintenance. Name changes should be implemented in publishers should regularly audit and correct new instances of changed names to prevent ongoing discrimination and dissemination of incorrect information. The working group's guidance document informed by these principles is under review now, and we anticipate releasing it very soon. As drafted, the guidance applies to all authors requesting name changes, regardless of their relationship status, gender affirmation, religious conversion, or any other personal reasons. In addition, as drafted, the guidance for journals and publishers, things such as those on the screen, posting a central email address or form where publishers can submit name change requests, never requesting or requiring proof of identification, updating HTML and PDF versions of articles, making name changes without issuing a correction notice unless specifically requested by an author, as doing so would only draw attention to the matter, limiting the number of people involved in name changes, both internally and externally, and publishers not needing to consult journal editors or to notify any co-authors in advance of issuing a name change. In keeping with COPE's goal of providing practical resources, the drafted document also includes a sample checklist for specific places that should be checked and may require updating by journals and publishers. And regardless of what ultimately is included, the COPE Working Group expects its guidance and resources will continue to evolve over time, particularly as standard processes and practices around post-publication author name changes become more prevalent. Thank you. I know that was, again, a whistle-stop tour, and as I hand things over to Dr. Tanenbaum to share some personal reflections and the longer-term vision and goals around name changes in scholarly publishing, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can post questions in the question box at any time.
Hi. So yeah, I'm Tess Tanenbaum. I'm an assistant professor at UC Irvine, where I run a group called the Transformative Play Lab. And I'm also one of the founders of the Name Change Policy Working Group, which is a group of almost 50 trans, genderqueer, and non-binary authors who have been working to advocate for name change policies in academic publishing. I've been working with COPE for less than a year, but for about 6 months on issuing new guidance around name changes, following the work that I did with the Association of Computing Machinery to help create the first trans-inclusive name change policy to be adopted by a major publisher. And so I've been working in this space since 2019, since July of 2019. And when I started this, there were not any policies that accommodated name changes in a way that created a sense of safety and privacy for vulnerable authors, especially for folks who changed their name as a result of gender transition. And at the time, I was early in my own transition and early in my own process, and I thought, surely this is easy. Surely we should be able to, make something happen here. And so I started working with my primary community, the Association of Computing Machinery, to try to create a policy that would simultaneously address the needs of my community and people like myself, while also making certain that the legal and obligations of the Association of Computing Machinery were respected, that they were not violating copyright, that they were not violating any of their responsibilities to anybody that they were in agreements with. And what this led to was a policy that started a conversation within the publishing world about where and when and how we change people's names. I see, actually, I'm going to take a question that I see in the chat now because I think it's a relevant one, which is that when I started doing this, I did this because I changed my name due to gender transition. But at the time, I had many colleagues and friends who had changed their names due to marriage or divorce and had been denied the opportunity to correct their name in their published record, or had been forced to make a personal decision about whether or not they were going to adopt their spouse's name, or in the case of divorce, discard a married name based on how they had published previously and what name they were known under previously. This is one of those areas where you can sort of see the patriarchal history of the publishing field, in that typically women change their names at marriage or divorce in our society. And if the publishing field had been centered around women's needs from the beginning, we wouldn't be having this discussion. I wouldn't need to advocate for name change policies, because the need to change names would already be taken for granted within how we approach things. And so my expectation for these policies is that trans authors have been leading the way on this, because we experience greater precarity and greater vulnerability and greater discrimination than people who change their names due to marriage or divorce. That's far less stigmatized in our society. However, in accommodating the needs of a vulnerable group, we create a more equitable situation for everybody. We create a situation where people shouldn't have to make decisions about the name that they live with throughout their daily lives based on their publishing record, or based on where they happened to have done their work previously, the name they happen to be working under. And so the policies that we've been drafting with COPE are expressly focused on making these kinds of changes accessible to everybody who changes their name for whatever reason. And there's a couple, and aside from the fact that this is the right thing to do, that everybody is entitled to be called by the name that they want to be called by, there's also a practical reason for this, which is that publishers are generally not well equipped to engage in acts of identity verification. Publishers are not equipped to police whether or not an author making a name change request is sufficiently transgender enough to warrant it. A publisher doesn't want to be in a situation where they have to make a judgment call about, is this person proving their gender identity in order to be accorded this accommodation? Nobody really wants to be in a situation where they have to do that. And so not only is a more broad-reaching and equitable approach more just, it's also more pragmatic. It's an easier way to think about this. And if we can have the next slide, actually, I think that's a good way to pivot into the things that I want to talk about for the future, which is that as we've seen more publishers adopt policies like this, the volume of the requests for name changes has increased. That multiple publishers now that in the last few months have already seen hundreds of requests. I believe the Association for the American Chemistry Society has changed papers going back to the 1970s in their records as a response to requests that they have received. And we're starting to see that as the publishing world shifts towards a space where they recognize that names do change and should be changed, and that authors are entitled to be credited under the name which they live, the volume of name changes is going to increase. And currently, we work within platforms and infrastructures that don't readily support large volume name changes, that the process is slow, the process is painstaking, it's often a manual process of updating documents, and it's quite labor intensive. And it's labor intensive for the people making the requests. It's labor intensive for the staff of the publishers or the associations or the journals that are carrying it out. And so the work that my group has been doing recently has been first to advocate for the adoption of these policies, which we've felt quite good about. And second, to begin working with people in the publishing world to develop tools, platforms, infrastructures, and workflows to support the execution of these policies. Something that I experienced with the Association of Computing Machinery was that the policy that I wrote was adopted in November of 2019. I didn't receive my name change within the ACM Digital Library until January of 2021. And I was the first person to receive a name change under that policy, and I was a member of the working group that was focusing on the implementation of these name changes. And so I was in a position of relative privilege and relative priority within the ACM's process. And there are people who have had requests in for well over 2 years who are still waiting to receive accommodation. And so what we have right now is we have a policy, but the policy does not have the infrastructure, the resources, or the staff underlying it to actually address one of the principles that we raise in our editorial for COPE, which is expediency, which is rapidity of name changes and updates. And so the things I'd like to talk about for the sort of the last bit of my talk here is some of the work that we're doing to envision what the future of academic publishing can look like when we think about the social identity of people being separate from the identity that we use for indexing. And so I'm actually just now starting a conversation with some folks at ORCID to talk about the role that I believe identifiers like ORCIDs will play in name change policies, because I think that it's critical that we start to separate out the identity of an author as an entity from the identity of an author as a social person, that our social identities, the names that we go by, belong to us. I should have the freedom to assert my identity however I wish it, and to be called by whatever name I wish to be called. That creates security, that creates privacy, that reduces many harms that I've enumerated in other places. But also, I have an interest in having my work associated with me consistently, of being credited correctly for my work, and publishers and journals have an interest in being able to track authors throughout their databases, to be able to track bibliometrics, citations, cross-referencing. And right now, the primary mechanism is to use the name followed by a number of contextual clues, right? And so if you take a citation and you see it was written by Tara Tanenbaum, and then you have co-authors, you have citations, you have DOI, you have affiliation, you have a number of other pieces of metadata. And the systems we use right now for things like citation tracking are able to infer from the constellation of metadata you have around an author who they are in relationship to other material inside their database. But this is never perfect, and I've heard many stories of people who have, I've encountered many folks who have been either had work attributed to them that was not their own because they had the same name as that person, or who didn't have work attributed to them correctly because their name had changed or because their name had been published under a shortened version of their name, Tess instead of Teresa. And in those situations, the process of disambiguation can be costly and expensive. If we move to a platform where the ID of an author is an unchanging fixed digital record, something like an ORCID, that allows us to do a far more robust, far less labor-intensive process of cross-reference and citation and bibliometric management. It also means that we've decoupled the name of the person, the social identity of the author, from the digital identity that the computational system uses to track them. This then moves to the next step, which is that I'd like to see us start to think about moving away from PDFs. And I know that sounds radical to some folks, but we're already starting to see publishers like the ACM adopting XML and HTML as the primary version of record and the primary published version of work. PDFs have not been around for more than about 3 decades, and they existed because the digital publishing platforms that we have adopted grew out of print publishing platforms, and they grew out of a need to control layout and a need to control the visual appearance of documents at a time when our goal was to recreate the experience of print in a digital space. But as we move further and further away from a world where print is prime and where print is the primary mechanism of dissemination of work, we move into a place where we need to start thinking about how to accommodate the different digital ways in which documents are encountered. Moving away from a static format like PDF gets us closer to documents that are more accessible, that are more screen readable, that can adapt to different computing environments and different mobile devices versus desktop devices. It also moves us to a place where we can incorporate something like an ORCID into the document as the mechanism for attribution, which means that we no longer have to worry about publishers being responsible for the name that's displayed on that document. The publishers only need to know that it was written by the person associated with this ID. And when you have that ID, the person who then administers their own ID can update their name locally, and that propagates out through every document that's connected to the ID. And ideally, this is where I'd like to see us. I'd love to see us in a place where publishers aren't expending resources updating records every time somebody changes their name, and authors aren't expending resources negotiating name changes with publishers, but instead, when an author changes their name, they correct it inside something like an ORCID, and they expect that this simply spreads throughout the network of linked documents that ORCID is attached to. That also gets us closer to starting to resolve one of the biggest lingering problems we face, which is the presence of incorrect names in bibliographies of citing papers, and also the ongoing propagation of the incorrect name as a result of people having downloaded older versions of the papers, having not updated their records, having not corrected their bibliographic databases. I think ultimately, we need to start thinking about renaming and name changes as an accessibility issue. That in the same ways that we've started to establish standards for accessibility issues like alternate image text, like screen readable versions of our files, that we need to start thinking about dynamic renaming as an issue that's similar to accessibility. That is, the papers are audited for at publication as part of the traditional pipeline of producing our documents. And I include within this dynamic correction of pronouns because as as challenging as it has been to get name changes adopted, pronoun changes are even more difficult because they're more context dependent, they're more ambiguous, and they require a much closer read of the document. With a name change, you can do a simple find and replace for the previous name and correct it. With a pronoun change, you have to look at the context in which a pronoun appears and determine who it is pointing to. And so I'd like to see us move towards a space in the future where we are able to actually stop producing policies around name changes and instead rely upon an infrastructure that expects that people's lives are fluid, that people's identities shift, that many of us change our names throughout our lives, and that the process of changing our name and changing how we are called doesn't change who we are or our right to have our work attributed to us correctly. And I believe that's where I'm going to hand things over to our next speaker, who is Caroline Porter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tess. Linda, could you just confirm that you can see my slide?
All good, Caroline.
Great, thanks.
All good.
Okay, so my name's Caroline Porter. I'm a trustee of COPE and I'm an executive publisher at Sage. I'm aware that as a white, able-bodied, cis woman, I come to the whole DEI conversation with a load of privilege, and I'm on a mission to educate myself as well as to support important work going on across our industry. I'm sure I don't need to tell the groups present here why it matters to consider offensive historical content. Content and language can influence how today's and future users of academic content think and act towards marginalised groups. And if, for example, they are part of such a group, how they feel about their role in society. As long as an article that marginalises the interests of certain people or groups stands in the record unchallenged, it has the potential to be cited and to influence harmful attitudes, beliefs, and political movements. So much harm has been done arising from flawed thinking of the past: the eugenics movement, conversion therapy, apartheid, unequal pay, disenfranchisement of various groups, to name but a few. Today, I'd like to start to define the problem and the key challenges that we face and what action we could consider taking. Whilst this part of today's session focuses on offensive historical content, it's important to note that there is plenty of current problematic content out there as well. Now, I know that a number of you have already been adding your questions. Please continue to do so. It's great to see them coming through. I will be taking the opportunity at the end of this session to get some input from you in the form of some Menti questions. So in preparation, please open your browser and go to menti.com. I would like to take the opportunity to acknowledge that there is a lot of reflection and discussion about this topic going on across the scholarly communication community, not just within COPE, but also within other organisations such as the Royal Society Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing, which a number of publishers, including Sage, participate in. Numerous publishers are discussing this topic, as are learned societies and editorial boards, and a number of these discussions have informed my presentation today. Some publishers have already started trying to systematically review their archives. And I'm not saying here that COPE or I have all the answers. I'm very keen to use today to continue and progress some of these discussions and as an opportunity to gather input. So in terms of definitions, we've used the term offensive in this session. We could equally have used harmful or marginalising, prejudiced, problematic, or discriminatory. Essentially, the key is to acknowledge that academic publications may contain arguments, findings, or language that are biased against one or more groups. For the purpose of this session, we're talking about published research articles that are based on racist, sexist, xenophobic, ableist, or homophobic, or otherwise discriminatory assumptions and ideas. Historical in relation to journal publishing could mean anything in a journal's archive prior to the latest article or volume, but as mentioned, these problems are not limited to the distant past. What I'm not covering here are problems with current content. There's a whole other conversation, some of which has been touched upon today, on the topic of conscious or unconscious bias in peer review and editorial decision making. And there's a lot more work to do in that area to enhance awareness and improve practices to reduce the likelihood of offensive content being published in the first place. I'm also not covering designing bias out of research in the first place, which is also a substantial and important issue. So the challenges set out here are built on a set of challenges articulated by Nicola Nugent at the Royal Society of Chemistry. There's the problem of scale. Many publishers or journals have tens or hundreds of thousands of articles in their archives, in many cases going back decades. It can be quite difficult to define what is offensive or inappropriate. That's creating a taxonomy is in and of itself a significant challenge. However, of course, the issue about problematic content goes beyond specific words that are obviously racist or offensive. It's about the thinking and assumptions underlying the research or influencing the way the article is written. The problematic nature of that sort of content can be less obvious at first glance. There's also the issue of finding or identifying what is offensive or inappropriate, and it's difficult to create a sort of systematic solution that can overcome the complexities of reviewing a journal archive. We could search for keywords in abstracts or titles, but that alone wouldn't catch all potentially problematic papers. The BMJ has developed a matrix showing different categories of harmful content, which I'm sharing here with permission, as it gives a useful framework for us in thinking about different types of content. I think we could have a whole session on trying to tackle each of these areas and only scratch the surface. And for today, I'm focusing largely on what to do with offensive content when we find it. These are a few headlines from Retraction Watch over the last 12 months. And I think it's important to note that no publisher is immune from discovery of offensive material in their back catalogue. At Sage, we've had more than one instance, I'm afraid, of discovering shameful content in our archive, such as this racist article linking brain size and cognitive ability to ethnicity. We were alerted to the article on Twitter, and following discussion with the editor, the article was retracted because the research was, and I quote, unethical, scientifically flawed, and based on racist ideas and agendas. This has opened up a whole conversation about whether there are other articles in this or other journals that warrant retraction. It's one thing when an article like this is brought to our attention and where the violations are clear, but it's another when we have an entire archive to look at. How far back do we go, and how do we narrow our focus in a conscious and responsible way? And it's worth saying that in this case alone, the archive of this journal goes back to 1955 and has over 23,000 records. So how do we handle a published paper that is flagged as potentially offensive or discriminatory? A few initial thoughts, really. Firstly, we need to be open about the tensions and complexities inherent in arbitrating on historical content. Trying to edit history itself is harmful. We should not pretend these biases did not exist. These papers can be artifacts that indicate some of the thinking of the time. We need to learn from history in order to avoid repeating the same mistakes. And it's important to expose the harm arising from such thinking. It's important also to recognise that judgment, culture, and societal expectations vary and change over time and space. What is perceived as offensive in one part of the world may not be offensive in another. I'd argue that we need to try and be nimble rather than perfect. It takes time to address these cases well and thoughtfully, and I think we can all learn and improve as we go. And I did just want to mention the place of social media, which can be very important in drawing attention to problematic content, but it can also create a whirlwind of pressure that can lead to knee-jerk or inappropriate responses. So let's be measured and considered here. The available courses of action, I think we can try and create a process for reviewing papers and work out who decides whether an article is harmful or problematic. You could look at creating a checklist for evaluating such papers with a set of questions to explore whether the underlying premises or findings are discriminatory or whether the article is an ongoing influence. Note the importance of power dynamics in terms of what is considered offensive or harmful, and by that I mean the structural issues at play. In terms of historical content, it's not just that our thinking and terminology was problematic, but the power systems behind knowledge gatekeeping were also unequal. It's important to engage with affected communities, and I think we need to consider how we do this sensitively and appropriately without unfairly burdening those groups. One option may be to create an oversight board of DEI experts to review papers flagged as problematic with compensation, who can also provide guidance and support. Actions available to editors and publishers include disclaimers, warning notices, expressions of concern, and retraction. A disclaimer could be a general statement that some content is offensive and reiterating their commitment to diversity, such as this one from Oxford University Press. We could equally put such a disclaimer on specific journals with an invitation to notify the journal if problematic content is discovered. Some journals might need to consider the possibility of a significant amount of content being flagged. You could issue warning notices such as this one from the Royal Society of Chemistry, which can be used at the article level if specific offensive or triggering language is discovered. Cope's retraction guidelines and the advice that retraction is appropriate when the article's findings are unreliable or the research does not meet scientific standards would be all that we need to reference for a large percentage of these cases to make the retraction decision. One important option for journal editors is to publish an editorial exploring or addressing the issue and looking into links between harmful content or ideas and harmful outcomes. Acknowledgement goes a long way here. I thought I'd quickly share a few other examples of organisations addressing historical positions. We have the AMA statement here on its history of excluding Black doctors, LA Times editorial acknowledging long-term racist viewpoints, and some university libraries carry statements on harmful or offensive content in the archive, such as these examples here. I thought I'd take a moment to think positively about where we're trying to get to. Ibrahim X. Kendi, who is the director of Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, says he has seen racism in all its ugliness in our time and across centuries, but has not lost faith in the beauty of human potential and the possibilities of a world where life, health, equity, and justice are inalienable human rights. We must believe change is possible in order to bring about change. We must be willing to do the hard research and policy and narrative and advocacy work to bring about change. And really here, the aim is to get to a better place on these issues in the interest of building knowledge and breaking down prejudice. And it's a shared responsibility to act on any and all bad science. So I am keen to start a discussion and to draw on the wisdom of everyone here. So please open your browser and go to www.menti.com and enter the code 87208143. I can see that a number of you are already answering the question here, which is great. So this is great to see. I'm going to quickly go back to the first slide in this deck, so apologies, just bear with me. Have you had to retract or take other action on an offensive published paper? I should note that when you're answering these questions, all answers are anonymous, and it's really just to kind of get a temperature check of the group on this call. So this is good to see. Interesting that in the vast majority of cases, this issue hasn't come up, but there's been a number where an action has had to be taken as well. I'm going to let that run for 30 more seconds if you want to add your take on this. Okay, I can see that nearly 100 people have responded, and that's great to see. Thank you. Next question. What criteria do or could you use to assess an article flagged as offensive? And this will be a word cloud that pops up as you start to enter your phrases. Please just enter single words or very short phrases here. Some really interesting comments coming through, looking at the potential harm, looking at the language, obviously racism, sexism, other forms of bias and stereotypes. Harm through conclusions, that's an interesting one, and potential for harmful use. That was definitely one of the areas identified in that matrix from BMJ. Offensive language, and then we've got some comments on how you would assess the article via internal editorial review, for example. List of words to search. Really, really interesting stuff coming through. Thank you. Okay, I will now move on to the next question. Who should decide whether an article is so offensive that it is unsound? And I think you can select up to 3 options here. I realise that, of course, it can be somewhat dependent on context, which Menti doesn't quite accommodate for. This is interesting. We're seeing consensus around the groups affected by the content, journal editor and publisher. Also editorial board and specialist committee, they can play a part as well. What action should be taken if a racist, sexist or otherwise discriminatory article is discovered in the archive? I think you can choose 2 options here. So the majority saying retraction or an expression of concern or editor's note. I think the advantage of any of these is that you can explore and explain the issues around the article and the reasons for its harm. Okay, and then the final question, which some of you already started answering, what resources, guidance or other action would you like to see from COPE in relation to offensive historical content? So I'll just give you a few seconds to, if you haven't already answered this question, to add your thoughts. So guidelines look like that would be the favourite option, but interesting to see flowchart and discussion documents as well as webinars and workshops coming out high as well. Just a few more seconds on this one. Really appreciate you all participating